Okay, a key part of this class is understanding religion and how religion interacts with geography. But also, I think what's important about this class is it sets up some of the information that you're going to get more in depth into next year in AP World History. So, as you can see from this map, different religions are more prominent in different parts of the world. And we're going to talk about really the major religions today, but that's important to understand that that doesn't mean that we're talking about all religions today. A different way of looking at this map is this one. And what this one does is it shows that there are a variety of religions that are practiced in individual countries. So you've got the main religion that's practiced in that country, but then you've also got a diversity of other religions that are practiced in that country. And part of that conflict is what we're going to be talking about in political geography next, in that you have sort of competing groups for who gets to have political power and who gets to have more space in the society. While you're listening to me talk on this video today, I would like you to be filling out this chart. And you could create it in your own notebook. You could make a copy of this in your own Google Drive and keep it there. But you're going to need the notes on these major religions. And what I'm going to talk about for each religion is where people are currently practicing this religion, how the religion has diffused over time, what are the key practices and beliefs that you need to know about, and then lastly, how this religion has affected the cultural landscape. So if we start off with Hinduism, Hinduism is an ethnic religion. So an ethnic religion is basically the opposite of a universalizing religion. So in an ethnic religion, people are born into the religion and members aren't actively seeking converts. And so most people who are Hindu, who in the entire world, live in India. Okay? Most of the people who are Hindu on this planet live in India. Some live in Bali. But if you notice, there are spots where there are other Hindus. And that has happened primarily through relocation diffusion, in that when Indian people move, they bring their Hinduism with them. And so, for example, we have Hindus in the United States. We have Hindu temples in the United States. But that Hinduism is in the United States because people who are Hindi left India and came here. Okay? Originally, it was spread through contagious diffusion. Like it was founded in Pakistan and then spread to India and then spread throughout the region. Okay? When we look at Hinduism, Hinduism originated in the Indus River Valley, which is in what is now known as modern-day Pakistan. What's interesting, however, is that it might have started in Pakistan, but that is not a place where it has strength at all. As a matter of fact, overwhelmingly, the majority of people in Pakistan are Muslim, not Hindu. And so it started in Pakistan, it spread to India, and that is where it has its strength. Okay? And so that's an example of where your hearth, where it started, is not necessarily where it continues to be popular after its founding. Some key ideas about Hinduism that you need to understand for this class are that Hindus believe in reincarnation, that you are born again and to another form, and that you move up or down sort of this ladder based on the choices that you make in this lifetime. And part of that has to do with this idea of karma, that you are going to be rewarded for good acts and punished for bad acts. Most Hindus do not eat cows, and part of that has to do with the fact that they feel like that is a sacred animal and that you wouldn't want to come back in another life as a cow and be eaten. Ritual bathing is something that is very much a part of Hinduism in terms of being able to cleanse yourself. And the other video that I asked you to watch talks about how the Ganges River is a real key part of Hinduism. There are these sacred texts called the Vedas, and that is where a lot of their beliefs come from, and those are really looked at as an important religious document. And another key idea historically for Hinduism is this idea of the caste system, which was a very rigid class system, and it meant that if your parent did a certain type of job, you could do that certain type of job. And the idea was that you were in that caste because of the decisions you made in your last lifetime. So if you were in a wealthy caste, you must have made very good choices. If you were in a bad caste or a lower caste, then you must have made bad choices. When you get to world history, you're going to learn about how Gandhi really struggled against this caste system, and how there has actually been some, like, this caste system is not as rigid nowadays in India as it used to be. An important term for this unit is polytheistic or polytheism, which is when someone believes in multiple gods. I think that frequently there are questions on the AP exam that ask about Hinduism being an example of a polytheistic religion. However, it's interesting that there is some debate as to whether or not Hinduism is a polytheistic religion. I don't have a stance on this. I'm not Hindi. But if you see a question that asks about the presence of many gods, polytheism would definitely be the answer. Some people argue that in Hinduism they don't have multiple gods because all of the gods are an expression of Brahman, and so really it's a monotheistic religion. I cannot answer that question, but I do think it's important for you to know what these terms are regardless. Sometimes religions spread and then they adapt, they change. And so a syncretic or compromise religion is something that I think is important to also understand. So when Hinduism spread, sometimes it spread and they got new converts, but sometimes it spread and people decided, you know what, we like some of these ideas, but not these other ideas. So Sikhism is actually an example of this type of religion. Some people created this idea of being a Sikh, and they said, you know what, we don't like the idol worship. They didn't like the different gods that, people were worshiping as a part of Hinduism, and they disliked the rigid caste system, but they liked the idea of reincarnation and karma. And so what they did is they adapted the religion and made it something that more fit their particular needs. When we talk about Hinduism, I think it's important that you need to cover like how the Ganges River has changed over time. Like, for example, they're having an issue with pollution because people want to be cremated and then have their ashes, spread in the river. But also a lot of temples are built on the sides of the rivers because they believe that the gods can come from the river to the temple and then go back to the river. But it's really important to understand that what people believe manifests itself on the physical planet through the cultural landscape. So Hindus believe that the erection of a temple, whether modest or elaborate, bestows merit upon the builder and will be rewarded. And so there are lots of Hindu shrines all over the place, okay? And I think that's important to understand that you can tell in a community what people believe by what types of buildings they build. And so as a geographer, you would want to look at those buildings as a way to give yourself a clue, a key as to like what are the belief systems of the people who live there. Next, we're going to go on to Buddhism. So Buddhism actually has 3 different branches, and something that you're going to notice the theme is that many religions have branches. Very few religions diffuse and spread and stay exactly the same. When things spread, they mutate, they change, they take on new ideas, they adapt to the people that are there. And so similarly, you've seen that with Buddhism. That Buddhism starts in India, it spreads to the rest of Asia, and it changes as it goes on that path. When you get to AP World History, you'll study in more depth how this change happens and what these branches of Buddhism look like now. What's more important right now for you to understand is that there are 3 branches of Buddhism and that it starts in India and it spreads throughout Asia. Okay? So Buddhism, its hearth is India. But what's interesting is similar to how India is not represented in its hearth, neither is Buddhism. So it starts in India and it spreads throughout Asia. And it splits off of Hinduism. Siddhartha is the person who eventually becomes known as the Buddha. Siddhartha was a prince in India, and he was incredibly wealthy, and he was very sheltered. And one day he left his castle, and he saw the huge poverty that existed in his kingdom. And he was like, I've never known suffering. How come the world is filled with so much suffering? And he was really outraged. And so he decided to leave his royal life, founded a new religion, got followers, and then went and spread that message to other places. Buddhism is an example of a universal religion. It's a universal religion because it is seeking converts, and it does have the ability to speak to people from a variety of different walks of life. It doesn't just speak to people who grew up in a specific ethnic group. It spread through both contagious as well as relocation diffusion. So an example of relocation diffusion and contagious diffusion, let's take one. You're going to study this more in AP World History, but so like you've got some examples where you've got emperors who like Ashoka was an emperor, and he becomes he decides to follow Buddhism, and then he decides to spend his wealth hiring missionaries who then go and spread through trade and through meeting with other people through contagious diffusion this idea of Buddhism different places. Similarly, you get relocation diffusion that happens. So as merchants are trading during between like 1200 and 1400, you've got people who are merchants traveling from place A to place B. They need a place to stay. The largest place in the community is a Buddhist temple. They stay in the Buddhist temple. They eat with the people who are Buddhist monks. They get talking with them about Buddhism. Eventually they convert. Then they go home. They take the religion with them. They spread it with other people. Okay? And so with Buddhism, you see examples of both contagious as well as relocation diffusion. So one of the main ideas of Buddhism is that life is suffering and that you shouldn't focus on that suffering. You should try to detach yourself from that. You should detach yourself from desire, from greed, from craving. And the way that you do that is by focusing on achieving enlightenment. In Hinduism, the idea is that you will eventually get to enlightenment. Buddha was arguing that actually you could get to enlightenment in this lifetime. And his method for doing that is that he encouraged people to take the Eightfold Path. And the idea of the Eightfold Path is that if you are doing things that are ethically right in terms of understanding, thought, speech, action, livelihood, effort, mindfulness, and concentration, you can focus yourself to get to that level of enlightenment, potentially even in this lifetime. And if not, then you can be reincarnated as well. In terms of how Buddhism affects the cultural landscape, one of the ways you can tell if there are Buddhists in a community is to see if there are pagodas. They have a very specific architectural style. And so that is something that if you see pagodas, you know that there are people who are Buddhists in that community. One thing that some Buddhists do is they take pilgrimages to places where Buddha taught. And one thing that you're going to notice as a theme is that in several of these religions, they have pilgrimages that people can take. And obviously pilgrimages would also change what the cultural landscape would look like. So in Islam, they also have pilgrimages or hajjs that people take to Mecca. But if you've got people going from one place to another, also in Christianity, there were frequently times that people would take pilgrimages to go to specific religious sites. But if you're having people go from point A to point B, frequently go and visit it, you're going to change that environment. You're going to create roadways. You're going to create pathways. You're going to need hotels. You're going to need places for people to eat. But you're going to change that environment because people are going through it repeatedly to try to get to a specific place. Judaism is the first monotheistic religion that is ever started in this country. And so that's important, not in this country, in this world. And so I think that's important to understand. Currently, there are 14 million Jews. 40% live in the United States and 40% live in Israel. So if you look at these two maps, they show how scale is important. So in the first map that's on the left, you can see that the United States and Israel have similar amounts of Jews. But if you look at the map that the scale is broken down by county, you can see that Jewish people are not evenly distributed throughout the United States. Disproportionately, Jewish people live in urban centers in this country and on the East Coast. And so I think that's important to understand that scale can give you a higher depth of knowledge. Okay? So it's important to understand that the hearth for Judaism obviously is in the Middle East. All three major monotheistic religions all started in the Middle East and spread from there. The primary way that Judaism has spread is through relocation diffusion. So as Jews moved from one place to another place, they brought their religion with them. There is a large diaspora of Jewish people, and that term diaspora, I think, is an important term for this unit. And what it does is it means that there is a community of people who might not all be next to each other, who still share an idea of a community. Okay. Obviously, a key thing to understanding Judaism and the diaspora is the fact that a huge section of Jewish people were murdered during the Holocaust, and that there was a large immigration from Germany because of the Holocaust and because of World War II from Germany to other parts of the globe. And so you see, that's how the majority of the diaspora ended up where it is, was because of that diffusion that happened during World War II. And if you remember, you want to think back to whether or not people have voluntary or involuntary types of migration, right, from Unit 2. In terms of thinking about key understandings about Judaism that you want to understand that it's the first monotheistic religion, that its holy text is called the Torah. The Torah is written in Hebrew, and so that is a language that's not only spoken in Israel, but it's also a language that Jews in the diaspora all over would speak as a religious language in order to be able to really read their religious texts and in order to be able to really, communicate about religion. Judaism I have 2 stories I want to share to sort of think about how Judaism affects the cultural landscape. So the first would be a major site for Judaism is the Western Wall or the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem. It is an important holy site for Judaism. And what's important as geographers as we think about is the fact that a holy site is important to one place, but some holy sites are important to multiple places. And so Jerusalem is a city that is actually important to all 3 of the world's monotheistic religions, to Christianity, to Islam, and to Judaism. And this particular wall shares a boundary with the Temple Mount, with the edge of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. And so that is important because this is a site that Jews and Christians and Muslims have had conflict over in Jerusalem for who gets to control it, how does it get to be used, and so part of that conflict is around religion because these sites are right next to each other and share boundaries, and different communities of people want to use them at the same time, and these communities of people lack trust in each other. And so that sort of political conflict develops because of the location of these different religious sites. Another example of a religious site I wanted to talk about for how it affects the cultural landscape would be Shir Tikva in Minneapolis. It's a synagogue in South Minneapolis. And what's interesting is that if you look at that architecture, that doesn't look particular. It's not particular to Judaism, that architecture. That building actually used to be a Universalist church. And then they sold it and it became a synagogue. Similarly, there's a Universalist church in another place in South Minneapolis that used to be a synagogue, but now it's a Universalist church. And that congregation, that synagogue, went and built a different location for themselves. And so one of the terms for this unit is sequent occupancy. And in Minneapolis, as different religious groups have gotten bigger, we have definitely seen religious spaces sometimes stay religious spaces, but house different communities. And so similarly, when we looked at those pictures, we also saw a picture of a mosque that has taken over a place that used to be a church. And so this is an example of a church that has now been turned into a synagogue. In terms of Christianity is also a major world religion. It's also a universalizing religion, and part of that universalizing nature is why it has spread so much throughout the world. So if you look here, there are Christians on every continent, for sure. They are the most prevalent in places like Europe and places like the Americas, although obviously there are lots of Christians in other places as well. Its hearth is that obviously it started in the Middle East, and it spread from there, and it spread through contagious, hierarchical, and relocation diffusion. So if you think about it in terms of contagious diffusion, it spread because its members would go talk to other people. So if you think about the prophets, they were out actively campaigning, talking about having met Jesus Christ, trying to convert people to Christianity, and so that's an example of that contagious spread. For hierarchical diffusion, sometimes people became Christians and they were royalty or they were an emperor, and then when they converted, they decided everybody below them was also going to convert. And so that is a big way that Christianity spread throughout Europe, was that members of royal families would convert, and then everybody would also partake that same religion. Relocation diffusion would be another way. So, for example, when people moved to the Americas, they brought their Christianity with them. Okay? In terms of thinking about Christianity, it's obviously also a monotheistic religion. It's split off of Judaism. Some people would argue that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. Other people would argue that Jesus Christ was the founder of Christianity and was, organizing for people to follow him and start this, offshoot of Judaism. The people who followed him became the prophets, and they wrote the Bible chronicling the stories of Jesus Christ, and that is the sacred religious text for Christianity. Originally, Latin was the language of Christianity, but as, for example, Protestantism takes off, Latin no longer becomes the language of Christianity, but it is still the language of the Catholic Church. Just like other religions that we've talked about, like Buddhism, there are branches of Christianity. You've got Orthodox, which is which would be out of like Greece and Russia, and I'm going to show you how that manifests itself in the cultural landscape differently. You've got Catholicism, which is centered in Vatican City, which is in Italy, and then you've got Protestantism, which started in Germany, and it splits off of Catholicism, and that's where you've got Lutheranism, you've got Presbyterianism, Methodists, Episcopalians, Baptists, all those types of religions that are Christian but not Catholic would be housed under Protestant. In terms of how Christianity manifests itself in the cultural landscape, definitely the cross is an important symbol. So in a community, if you see high towers, going to the sky, and you see crosses on the top of them, that is a sign to you that it is a Christian building. Frequently, Christian buildings have stained glass. Frequently, they have crucifixes. Those are things that can be clues to help you figure out whether or not this community is Christian or not. If you look at the picture in the right-hand corner, these are called onion domes. And if it's an Orthodox church, they would have those types of onion domes. Something that's unique about Christianity is that they bury their dead, and so Christians definitely have cemeteries, and if you look at their cemeteries, they're also marked with the same types of crosses. Okay? Islam is the last religion we're going to cover in this video. It is also a universal religion, which means that it actively is looking to convert people, just like Christianity. If you look here, Islam is a major world religion. So the countries that are in green, 50% of the population and more are Muslim. The countries that are yellow, 10 to 50% of the population is Muslim. The spread of Islam happened in several different ways. So first of all, you've got contagious diffusion, that people went and talked about Islam and spread it to other people, and it particularly spread by trade and by conquest. And so when you get to world history, you're going to talk about how trade routes, like for example, throughout Africa, throughout the Middle East, are set up between like 1200 and 1450, and that like spreads Islam through the regions, and it becomes a method by which, and actually Muhammad, the founder of Islam, was actually a merchant, and so merchants convert, and then they are trading and going throughout the area and then taking that message of Islam with them. You've also got examples of hierarchical diffusion. So for example, in some African kingdoms, the king would convert to Islam, and then he would tell his followers that they were also going to convert to Islam. Frequently, that meant that Islam actually didn't get adopted exactly the way that it was in the Middle East. So, for example, in African kingdoms, what would happen is the king would convert to Islam, and the people would go, okay, well, we're going to add Islam to our animistic religion that we already have. And so, so it's important to understand that when something diffuses, it doesn't always diffuse 100% the way that it was created. And then you've also got relocation diffusion. So when people move, they take their religion with them. And so most of the Muslims that are in the state of Minnesota are Muslim because their families moved here from another country. And so I think that we have our own examples of that type of relocation diffusion here. When you talk about Islam, it's important to understand that there's sort of two major branches, Sunni and Shia. And we're going to talk about that more when we get to comparative politics. But what I think is important for you to understand is that the majority of the world's Muslim population are Sunni. But, for example, in Iraq, in Iran, in parts of Afghanistan, in Syria, you've got populations that are Shia, and in Yemen. And so one of the major conflicts that we're going to talk about when we get to Iran is that Iran is Shia in a neighborhood that is Sunni. And that this is a conflict that it has with its neighbors, and it is definitely a conflict within Islam. And so we will talk about that more. In terms of understanding Islam, it's important to understand that there are 5 pillars, 5 things that all people who believe in Islam are supposed to do. They're supposed to fast during the month of Ramadan from sun up to sundown. They're supposed to give money and help to the poor. They're supposed to declare that they believe in the one true God, Allah. And they're supposed to pray 5 times a day facing Mecca. And if they can in their lifetime, they are supposed to take a pilgrimage to Mecca. And so something to think about is that changes an environment when that many people are moving to go to a specific place. And so Mecca is definitely a very different city from the rest of the Middle East, in part because of the large quantity of people that come to Mecca every year for their pilgrimage. Important things to note in terms of looking at the cultural landscape and how Islam shapes it. In the Middle East, you definitely see that there are these minarets all over the place, and they call people to prayer 5 times a day, and that is sort of one of the quintessential signs of a Muslim community. But also another thing that's important to look at is that their religious space is decorated very differently. In Islam, it is actually forbidden to show representations of Muhammad or to show representations of God. And so Muslim spaces are decorated with calligraphy, with flowers, with patterns, geometric patterns, but they are not decorated like Christian sanctuaries, which are decorated with pictures of Jesus, pictures of the Virgin Mary, pictures of prophets. Those types of things are entirely forbidden in Islam. So my hope is that you have a better foundational understanding of these major world religions so that you can analyze them as a geographer.